welcome to the Kink Perspective. My name's Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. Today's episode is a little bit different. It's kind of stemming from something I received in an email, but I'm not actually going to get into the whole email today. I can't for a lot of reasons. I want to say this again. I know a lot of times you all email me or you ask me stuff in the AMAs or even passing comments. I'm not answering your questions because first I'm like putting it behind a paywall or anything. There are some questions everybody asks me or people ask me, I just can't answer, right? So I'm not doing it with intention here. It's just a reason. But today I want to talk about something a little bit different, kind of off of this question, but more so in a generalized sense. Over the years, there's one thing I've noticed is that how often people use the words responsibility and obligation as they're sort of interchangeable. Now, a lot of us don't even stop to think about it. I think we say we're staying because it's the responsible thing to do, right? We keep showing up because we feel like it's our duty, right? Sometimes there is truth to that, but a lot of times there isn't. Sometimes responsibility quietly becomes obligation. And along the way, choice disappears and we stop saying, this is what I want to do. And we start saying, I don't have any other choice. Now, from the outside, that's not a whole lot is really changing. We still go to work and we're in the relationship and, we meet our commitments and we honor our families. So the behavior here stays the same. What's changed is our relationship to it. Now, as I do always before I get further into this day, I want to take a moment and thank all of you who continue to show up each week, continue to listen, that keep the show growing. That's really what this is all about. I want to say thank you to my newest listener all the way in Amman, Jordan, who just recently found the show and I had a really nice email exchange with. So if you're listening and you're starting to explore your life there or anywhere in the world that you're listening to the show, appreciate you being here. All right, if you're listening to me, do me a favor. If you're hearing me on Spotify, especially if you're on the app, click the three dots, go over, rate the show 5 stars. This allows the show to find others, keeps the show growing. If you're on YouTube, like, subscribe. That way you don't miss a new episode when they drop, as much as YouTube ratios my shows and they keep it private and I got to go back and click it public. I do check it. Trust me. I do it as best I can. Right? If you're new, I appreciate you being here. And for those of you who do ask me, yes, if you'd like to contribute to the show, there is a link in the show. There's a donation link in the show's description. Any small amount or large amount does go to keep these conversations coming forward. All right, let's get back to this. Look, today's episode is not going to be about telling you all how to leave a relationship or walk away from your commitments, right? In fact, sometimes staying is exactly the right choice. What I want to explore today is something a little bit more subtle. How do we know the difference between carrying a responsibility because it reflects our values and carrying an obligation because we stopped believing we're allowed to choose differently? Now, psychologically here, those are two very different places to live, even if they look identical from the outside to a lot of people, right? And I think understanding that difference changes the way we think about our relationships, about our family, power exchange, and even the relationship we have with ourselves. Today, that's exactly what we're going to get into. So this first part here, what I really want to talk about is responsibility versus obligation. I think one of the reasons this conversation matters is because most of us use the words responsibility and obligation so interchangeably. We hear someone tell us, and we, our friends, even ourselves, our partners, whatever, it's my responsibility. We rarely stop to ask whether that's actually true or they're just describing something very different. Now, when we look at them, right, if we do a surface level comparison, they almost look identical, right? People go to work, they take care of their kids, they do family stuff. Now, if we judged only by what we could see, we'd probably conclude that nothing has changed, right? But when I look at this type of stuff, or even as, in the bigger psychological community, it encourages us to look a little bit deeper than the behavior alone, because what drives our actions is often just as important as the actions themselves. When I think about responsibility, I think about values. First thing for me, right? Responsibility is something we willingly carry because it reflects the kind of person we want to be. That doesn't mean it's always, you know, enjoyable or easy. And it certainly doesn't mean we're not going to question it. Every meaningful commitment does come with a sacrifice, right? I think about the parents who lose sleep over their kids, or partners who make compromises, right? Or a caregiver who puts somebody else's needs ahead of their own. All of these things can be very difficult, but there's still an internal sense of ownership. If someone asks why you're doing it, the answer usually begins with, you know what, because I believe this matters. And that burden may be heavy, but it still feels like you're carrying a choice to move that forward. Obligation is a very different psychological quality here. Instead of hearing, I choose this, we start hearing, I have to. I don't have another option. There is no other choice for me, right? If I don't do this, everything's going to fall apart. Notice how quickly here the language shifts away from values and towards pressure. The focus is no longer on what matters to us, it's on what we believe will happen if we stop, right? Fear, guilt, expectations, the desire to avoid disappointing someone else gradually become the driving force. So now the behavior itself may not change, but the emotional experience underneath it changes dramatically. Now, psychologically, I think the biggest distinction here comes down to agency. And you've heard me talk about agency over the years because agency is it's a very large part of our lives, and we either hold on to it or we let it go, right? Agency is our sense that we're actively participating in our own lives, that we're making choices even when those choices are difficult. We recognize that every path can carry a cost, but we know we have the ability to decide which cost we're willing to accept. Responsibility that, maybe preserves that sense of agency, or obligation that can erode it. Now, over time, life can begin feeling less like something we're creating and more something like it's just happening to us. Now, we need to understand that shift because people who lose their sense of agency often begin feeling like they're trapped, right? And they don't even necessarily know why. What makes this difference so difficult to recognize, right? Now, two people can do exactly the same thing for completely different reasons. Let's try this one for size. I'll start with you parents. Now, both of you wake up at, I don't know, 2 in the morning to care for your crying baby. Now, one is exhausted and thinks, this is hard, but, this is my child and I want to be, and that's where I want to be. I want to be there for them. Now, the other parent feels the same exhaustion, but thinks, my life isn't mine anymore. Now, the action is completely identical here, but the internal experience couldn't be more different. The same thing can happen in a career, marriage, outside of our DS dynamics, right? Or any type of long term commitment. From the outside, both people appear equally devoted, but inside, one of them is living from conviction and the other person is living from necessity. And I think that's where the suffering often begins, because it isn't always because our circumstances have changed. Sometimes it's because our relationship to those circumstances has changed. We stop experiencing our commitments as choice that reflect who we are and begin experiencing them, I don't know, as a prison we believe we can no longer leave. That shift, it starts out small, right? Maybe we don't even notice it at first, right? Until you spend enough years wondering why the feeling of disconnection from a life that, what on paper looks good and exactly the same, but doesn't feel like yours. And then we have this next part that we're going to get into, the slow drift away from yourself. Now, I think this is one of the biggest misconceptions people have, is believing that losing themselves happens all at once. They imagine, waking up one morning and looking around and suddenly realizing they're no longer recognizing their own life. Now, in the real world, it doesn't work that way. Most of the time here, it's a very gradual process. It happens through our decisions, our compromises, and the little moments that don't seem, I don't know, particularly significant on their own. Each one makes sense at the time, and they're all temporary, but as we start looking back, that's when people often realize just how far they've drifted. Human beings are remarkably adaptive. It's one of the reasons, we've survived as a species for so long. We learn to adjust to difficult environments and, how the circumstances change and even uncomfortable emotions. Adaptation can be an incredible strength because it allows us to endure challenges that would otherwise overwhelm us. The problem is that our minds don't distinguish particularly well between situations that require endurance and the ones that require change. We become accustomed to almost anything if we stay there long enough. Think about how often people tell themselves, you know what, things are just going to settle down after the holidays, right? Then that slowly shifts into, once work isn't so busy, and later on, hey, you know what, when the kids are older, eventually another milestone takes its place, followed by another, and then another. None of those thoughts they're not unreasonable by themselves. The difficulty here is that they keep us pushing the conversation into the future while the present becomes permanent. And during that process, something else begins to change. People tend to ask themselves a fairly simple question: what do I want? It's a question that I ask people: what do you actually want out of your life? And the question reflects curiosity and personal ownership. It assumes there's still room to consider your own needs and values and directions over time, right? But the question changes without us even noticing. Instead of asking what we want, we begin asking what will create the last disruption. What decision can we make that's not going to disappoint a lot of people, right? How do I keep it all together for just one more day? All of these questions are about managing discomfort. And this is where identity quietly enters the picture. The longer we occupy a certain role, the easier it becomes to confuse the role with who we are. We become the reliable one or the provider or the peacekeeper, right? We're just the person who doesn't leave. Eventually, we stop examining whether those roles still reflect our values because, maintaining that image feels a lot safer than if we question it, right? So then everything looks stable, but inside of us, stuff is starting to slip away: who we are, how we feel, right? And I think that's why this process is so difficult to recognize while it's still happening. There's usually isn't, this whole big epiphany that happens. It's just simply hundreds of ordinary moments that span over, I don't know, years, maybe a decade, where we choose familiarity over uncertainty, right? We go with what we know over honesty. Now, none of those decisions seem life changing on their own, but if you take them together, they slowly move us further away from ourselves. By the time many people begin asking why they feel disconnected or exhausted or even numb, the real issue isn't that life suddenly stopped fitting. It's that they've adapted to a version of it that no longer reflects who they are. Now, before I get back into the rest of the show today, I want you all to know that this show is supported by Enhanced Mind Counseling. Sometimes the hardest part isn't deciding what to do. It's understanding why a decision feels impossible in the first place. That's often where the work begins. Together, we can look at patterns and beliefs and relationship dynamics that quietly shape the choices people make, helping them understand what's really driving them rather than simply reacting to what's happening on the surface. If that's something you're trying to work through, you can reach out through my website. There's a link in the show's description. All right, let's get back to it. So, why do people stay? This is the question I get. Chris, why do people stay in these relationships all the time? Well, it's a very good question. Because one of the most common reactions people have when they see someone remain in something unhappy? Why don't they just leave? Now, it sounds like a reasonable question, you know, if someone's dissatisfied or, living in circumstances that no longer fit who they are, walking away appears to be the obvious solution. But that rarely works in, a straight linear path. Human beings don't make many of their biggest choices by comparing happiness to unhappiness. What we're doing is weighing one form of pain against another. Remaining carries its own cost because we know what it is. But so does stepping into the unknown. And uncertainty is something the mind has always treated with caution. There's something when I'm working with people that, it's a concept, and it's going to sound simple when I say this, right? It's going to sound really simple, but it's not, because your mind has to learn it. When they hear the word new, when someone hears the word new, right? What happens? They panic because new is not what they're used to. It's not the path. It's not the blueprint. So new automatically then equals scary. So what we have to teach is new just means we're not talking about new. What we're talking about is unexplored. And unexplored doesn't mean unsafe. What that does mean is it means either safe or unsafe, but we don't know that yet, right? We don't know what that new means until we explore it. What we have to do is just go slow. Now that sounds like an easy concept, but sometimes that takes people months to understand, to adapt to ease into, right? And the reason why is because our brains place tremendous value on predictability. We naturally move forward towards what feels familiar as human beings because, that is predictable. We understand it, we know it. It doesn't matter though, even if it's a little bit unhealthy, because at least we understand the outcome is going to be. And I want you to think about that for a moment. A difficult relationship, a mind numbing, exhausting career, right? They may still provide the one thing that the unknown never can. They provide certainty because you get the outcome. You know what tomorrow will probably look like, especially if you have terrible colleagues at work, or you're not in a relationship that's fulfilling and you're not talking. At least you understand that you're not having that conversation tomorrow, and your colleagues at work are still going to be the same crappy people you've got to deal with day in and day out, right? Because you understand the rules, even if you don't like them. You understand what emotional price you're going to pay. Now, none of that to anyone from the outside does that sound appealing at all, right? Yet it feels manageable because you've survived it for so long. The alternative offers possibility, but it also introduces the question without answers, right? If I go this route, will my life actually improve? What if I end up regretting my choice, or I hurt someone I care about, right? All of these questions and more carry a whole lot of emotional weight, and they do. And I can think about somebody right now who's wrestling with that, right? And it just sounds easy. Why would you do these things? Because it's the predictability. At least we understand what types of roles we're going to be in. And we understand that even if we don't like it and it causes us pain, we know what the pain feels like. So in its own way, it's safe, right? And this is one of the reasons I encourage people to avoid judging someone else's decisions too quickly. It's easy to look from the outside and believe the other person's path is obvious. We don't see a lot of things, right? Because there's so much invisibility in people's lives. We don't know what shapes or forces a decision. Guilt is overwhelming, right? Fear, pain, aging parents, all of these things, money, right? People organize their lives for decades around all of these things, right? All of this. None of these concerns, though, automatically determine what the right course of action is, but pretending they don't exist oversimplifies here a deeply human struggle. And we can't even forget about our identity, because that plays a really large role, right? Over enough time, our roles begin merging with our sense of self. So we stop thinking of ourselves as individuals, making a choice, and become the dependable one or devoted parent or the provider, whatever the case may be. Those identities over developed years reinforce the patterns we live by. So if we start questioning a major life choice, we're not just talking about a relationship, we're asking ourselves what's going to happen next when the role changes. And that's an unsettling place to be and stand, right? Because then the future of that predictability disappears. Now, there are some people who are working through that and they're making their choices and they're taking their steps one step at a time, right? So they can make sure that when they land on both feet, right? And there are some that just look at the choice and they can't face the question, and that's okay too. This is not about being easy. None of this is. Human beings are terribly complex, right? And then we assume if somebody sees this, all they see is this broken version. So we just keep the gruff, tough exterior that I'm dependable, I'm reliable, I'm devoted, all of these things, because that is what, like I said before, it's just simpler. Not that I'm breaking inside, not that I want a different life, right? Or I've tried to have the same conversation 1,000 times and it goes nowhere, right? We face a choice. I really think it's important also that, and this is kind of what I was just talking about. Fear doesn't really, come out directly, right? A lot of people don't really wake up one morning and say, I'm here because I'm afraid. Fear is one of the biggest drivers inside of people, right? And it can disguise itself in a whole lot of tricky ways: patience, practicality, responsibility, even loyalty, right? We convince ourselves that next year it's just going to be a little bit better, right? Things are going to change. We're going to start talking more, right? Now, look, sometimes those hopes are really justified and other times they're not. The challenge is that those explanations can become so familiar, we stop asking whether they're still true or whether they've become comfortable stories that protect us from making an extraordinarily difficult decision. Now, understanding why someone remains where they are isn't the same as telling them they should remain there. Those are two completely different conversations. And in my role, it isn't about deciding another person's future. It's about understanding the forces influencing their choices. Once those influences become visible, people have an opportunity to ask themselves a far more meaningful question. Am I acting from my own values, or am I allowing my fear to quietly make the decision for me? And that question doesn't automatically tell anyone what they should do, but it does move them closer to something many have lost without realizing it: the freedom to choose with honesty rather than simply continuing because changing feels scary. And you wouldn't believe how much I see this every day. And it's not that easy. Even if I can see it and I can recognize that, telling people, "Oh, here's what you got to do." It is. It's like the biggest baby steps in the world, because those baby steps are extremely frightening, and some people can never take them. That's not my decision. My decision is to, or my explanation is to help them understand the choice and the drivers. And that's your job, to understand your motivations behind it, right? I'm not saying you got to quit the relationship or you got to walk through a new choice. I'm not. But allowing yourself to understand the choice is there, that sometimes can just be as scary, right? You don't have to run from it. So here's the question that nobody asks. And one of those I think people spend far too much time on is asking, what does happen if I leave? It's an understandable question because major decisions deserve a lot of thought. Relationships, family, getting into a new apartment with people, right? Careers, education, right? All of it. They all carry consequences that ripple far beyond the individual making that choice. Taking those consequences seriously isn't a sign of weakness. It's part of being an adult, it's part of being thoughtful. What does get overlooked here, though, is another question that deserves just as much of attention as that one does. Yet, we don't even hardly ask it. What happens if nothing changes? And it's surprisingly easy to treat staying where we are as if it's some sort of neutral decision. We examine every outcome, making no change or making a little change, but all we're doing in reality is imagining the worst case scenarios, disappointing people or financial problems or regret. But meanwhile, we remain exactly where we are, right? Because what that does is it removes the same level of scrutiny we're giving the other question. We assume that because today's circumstances feel familiar, they're somehow cost free. They're not. Time continues moving forward, whether we make an active decision or not. Relationships continue evolving. Opportunities continue passing. We continue becoming someone through the choices we make and the ones we avoid. That's why I think it's important to recognize that every meaningful path carries a price. Leaving comes with loss and uncertainty, right? Remaining maybe makes you accept the ongoing distance or realization that your life no longer reflects what matters most. Even postponing the decision has consequences because waiting isn't the absence of choice. It's a choice to allow today's circumstances, if you will, to continue shaping tomorrow. Now, whether that's the right decision depends entirely on what's being made. But this brings us back to where we began. Responsibility isn't defined by how difficult something is. Many responsible decisions are incredibly painful. What distinguishes responsibility is that the burden is accepted because it reflects deeply held values. There's still ownership, even when the road is difficult. An obligation feels different. The cost continues being paid, not because it aligns with personal conviction, but because the possibility of choosing another direction, no longer feels real. That's an entirely different psychological and emotional experience, even if no one on the outside notices the difference. And I also think it's really important to remember that understanding this distinction, sorry, my words are getting a little slurry today. No, I haven't been drinking before. Somebody asked me that the other day. I don't drink. Maybe like once or twice a year. Sometimes I just speak too fast. So I'll start that part again. What was it saying? Oh, yeah. We need to understand that this distinction isn't a whole big invitation to make a dramatic change overnight, right? I'm not telling you to go out and start changing your life tomorrow, right? Being self-aware doesn't, tell you what to do next. It gives you the opportunity to understand your motivations with a little bit more honesty. Am I continuing this because it reflects the person I want to be, or because I've convinced myself there isn't really another option? Those answers to that question deserve a whole lot of grace and patience and reflection. Sometimes a really difficult conversation, but guess what? They deserve the most. They deserve the truth. And the real question behind today's discussion here, not whether someone should stay or leave, but whether the life they're living still represents a conscious choice. When responsibility guides our decisions, we remain connected to our values even through sacrifice. When obligation quietly takes that place, we spend years or decades carrying a weight that no longer belongs to us. And if you can recognize the difference, it may not change our circumstances right away, but it can change the way we understand ourselves. And sometimes it's the first step towards living with greater honesty, regardless of where that path eventually leads. Now, as I wind this episode down today, I don't want you walking away thinking this whole episode was about staying or leaving. It's not. Life is rarely ever, if ever, that simple, right? And I'm going to also say this. There is no podcast on this planet, no therapist, psychiatrist, or anyone else that has enough information to tell another person what they should do inside of their relationships or career or family or whatever. What I do hope that you're going to take away from today is some encouragement for you to become curious about something that we can often overlook inside of ourselves. Not simply the decisions we make, but the reasons we're making them. Those reasons matter because they shape the relationship we have with ourselves long before they shape the relationship we have with anyone else. Some of the most meaningful commitments we're ever going to make, right? They require sacrifice. They ask something of us. Sometimes they ask us for a great deal. And there's nothing wrong with carrying a heavy responsibility, right? Especially when it reflects the person we want to be. The challenge is making sure that somewhere along the way, you haven't quietly replaced conviction with obligation without realizing it. And I think all of us should revisit that from time to time because people change. Our circumstances change. Our relationships are going to evolve because they do. What was once freely chosen should never end up being something we're afraid to honestly examine a little bit later. And looking forward and inward in life isn't a betrayal of your commitments. It's exactly the thing that protects them, right? So here's today's reflectionary question for you all, because I like giving you these, even though I don't get a lot of answers. I'm going to say that because, yeah, you know what? I'm doing this because I want you all to talk about it, right? I want you to think about it. I want you to invoke something, right? I'm not asking you a question because I just want to keep asking, but here it is. When was the last time you asked yourself why you're still choosing this? I want you to think about that, right? All right. I don't have anything. I'm not going to talk about any negative stuff today. Just not. I have some stuff that I don't really care that much. Positive, happy stuff. Paying it forward. I know I didn't do it. I don't know if I did it the last couple of weeks. I know I didn't do it last week. I am going to. I don't know how I got roped into this one, but I'm going to do it anyways. I'm going to a puppy bake sale. So I'm actually going to go to this big kitchen where they bake treats for like 4 or 5 animal shelters, and then all the puppies get like these little handmade cookie treats. Now, initially when I heard this, I'm like, oh, I mean, I love animals. For anybody who knows me and has heard me talk about animals over the years, doing this stuff, now I'm gonna have fun when I go get to play with the puppies. But me baking, not really. But I'm going, right? I've committed. I've committed to like 4 hours this upcoming weekend. I want to hear about paying it forward. I don't care what it is, making somebody else's life better. I'm doing this because the people who at a couple of these shelters, they don't do it for the recognition. And God knows they need the help. And I think this is the community's way of giving back to these wonderful shelters. I'm not, that's why you don't hear me name them or anything, because I'm not doing it for that. That's not what I want. I'm doing it because I want to devote my time. We all talk about we want to see the world be a better place, yet there's a lot of vitriol on all sides. I don't really care what side of the world you live on. But if you want it to be a better place, that change has got to start with you. So let's do a little bit of positive forward. Maybe be nice to a neighbor, call somebody you haven't spoken to in a while. Do something. Pay it forward. It's all I ask. Right? It's not a lot. Tell me about it too. I'd like to hear about. I love hearing about that stuff. Last time I think somebody was telling me about they did something with horses. I can't remember. I know your comments on Spotify, but I remember you said, went and did this, and I just love that. I think it's great. Right? No, I have no more book updates right now. No, nothing. All that's kind of weirdly, I'm like in a hiatus. But it's coming. I promise. I don't know. Maybe at the end of the year, when I take a couple of weeks off and I'm just working with the vets, I'll go ahead and devote a whole lot of time and see what I can knock out. I do better when I don't have a lot going on. Just right now, I've got a lot going on. I'm going to address this to you again. Chris, why are you so private? If I talk about myself, it takes away from the work, and I want the work to remain on the work, right? I do this so you all have a way to understand yourselves, right? Number two, and the bigger reason here is secrecy, or not secrecy, privacy. There was an incident a long time ago, and I'm not going into any details. I've spoken about it publicly a lot. I've written about it till I'm blue in the face. So privacy, I have a right to it too. If that bothers you, that's okay. If you choose that I'm not that forthcoming and you need to know about, the size of my t-shirt, I'm not telling you, well, guess what? Then I'm probably not the person for you. That's okay. It's all right. I'm not offended, right? Pretty much don't know any therapist that's going to start telling you some of the personal questions I get asked because we're just not going to divulge that, right? And by the way the law is written, we don't have to do a whole lot, but that's okay. I don't expect you to know that. Anyway, that's it. That's all I have for you. So I'm going to give you guys the question again. I want to see socials lit up. YouTube, Fet, Spotify, Substack. I don't care where you follow me. Instagram, if you're there. Instagram, I don't really do a whole lot. Those are more memes and stuff. I just want to be clear about that. On X, I don't have a whole lot. I don't do a whole lot on X, right? It's going to tell you all. I have an X account. All I do is I post the stuff that goes to Instagram goes to X. I just do it because I want. I do it because I want, if people are looking for an answer, it's there, right? That's it. Nothing special. I'm not hiding anything, right? Anyway, here's your question one more time. When was the last time you asked yourself why you're still choosing this? Right? Sit, think about it, let me know. Until next time, everybody, be safe and stay kinky.